California High-Speed Rail is one of the largest and most expensive civil works projects in American history. Its aim is to connect San Francisco and Los Angeles via the Central Valley. Because of its nature of being a large and expansive civil infrastructure project, it receives quite a lot of press, most of it negative and not very well researched. This video aims to debunk common myths and misconceptions about the project and hopefully lead to a more informed public about the project. Hopefully we can convince you that California High-Speed Rail is still worth the investment that it deserves. I'm Andrew, and this is the past, present, and future of California High-Speed Rail. A project of this scale had an understandably complex history. To grasp its current state and scope, it is important to do some historical analysis. With many of its newer cities growing horizontally rather than vertically and a stark absence of any substantial public transportation, California found itself with a myriad of planning and transportation problems. Congestion clogged its roadways, air pollution ravaged city centers, and it was quickly approaching a limit in statewide transportation capacity. A solution needed to be found that didn't involve expanding highways as had been done in the past. One of the ways California sought to address these issues was through the use of alternate transportation methods, i.e. public transit. It provided additional funding and support to intra-city and regional public transportation options like Amtrak. Today, these long-distance routes cover many of the large population centers within the state, with commuter railroads like Metrolink, Caltrain, and Coaster offering movement within metro areas. The Pacific Surfliner, an Amtrak route between San Luis Obispo and San Diego, is the most traveled route outside the Northeast, with almost 2 million riders in 2024. However, many critical gaps in these regional transportation networks remain, the largest one being a direct link between LA and San Francisco that operates in a reasonable amount of time and is competitive in price and convenience to driving or flying. The current trip requires multiple transfers and is usually around 8 hours long. For context, a nonstop drive is around 6 hours with no traffic. This is the most visible problem that California High-Speed Rail aims to tackle, along with reducing emissions, increasing transportation capacity throughout the state, and offering alternatives to flying and driving. Ever since the 1980s, California has been interested in doing high-speed rail. In the 90s, there were multiple projects proposed, connecting different areas of Southern California with high-speed rail, but ultimately all of them fell through due to lack of private funding. However, all of that changed in the 1990s when the federal government stepped up and designated 5 high-speed rail corridors throughout the United States, one of them being the high-speed rail corridor connecting San Francisco and Los Angeles. When that happened, the state of California created a Intercity High-Speed Rail Commission to research the feasibility of creating and implementing high-speed rail on this route. Ultimately, it was succeeded by the High-Speed Rail Authority, which we know today as the body that's building this actual route. Through its creation, the state government said that the authority would be required to prepare a plan for the construction and operation of a high-speed rail train network for the state, consistent with and continuing the work of the Intercity High-Speed Rail Commission, to submit that plan to the legislature and the governor or to the voters of the state for approvals except as specified. The bill states that constructing this high-speed rail was more cost-effective than expanding highway and aviation infrastructure capacity, and thus was a good choice for California. They also stated that it met future transportation demands better, along with being more green and able to be done due to advances in high-speed rail technology demonstrated in Europe and in Asia. In 2008, the authority published its first business plan, showing how it would execute on the wishes of the governor and the legislature. In this document, it laid out the plans for the system, along with a cost estimate and development timeline. It estimated the cost to be around $33 billion in 2008 dollars, and pegged the completion date around 2020. These initial estimates were woefully incomplete and under budget and have haunted the project ever since. They were an extreme underestimate of the exact scope and complexity of America's first high-speed rail construction. It's important to note that all other estimates after 2008 were put in year of expenditure dollars, or YOE. This means that estimates would be calculated to account for inflation, as not all contracts would be executed at the same time. Estimates have only increased since then, with current 2024 cost projections sitting between $89 and $128 billion. So what drove these cost increases? Why were the initial estimates so inaccurate? The answer lies with how early project planning and construction was handled. The required work was to be set aside into 3 construction parcels given to the private industry to bid on. Now, the one problem was the authority wanted construction done or started before the 2012 deadline. Why was there a 2012 deadline? It's a little complicated, but it mainly has to do with the fact that the grants from the federal government were only going to be distributed if the authority started construction in the Central Valley by that 2012 deadline. What kind of things weren't ready that caused the delays and the cost increases and whatnot? Well, a few things. First of all of the required parcels were not in the hands of the authority for the needed alignment. Second of all, design was only at about 15% complete, so there was still a lot more design work that needed to happen before the actual structures could start to be built. And lastly, the authority had no master plan or idea of where the utilities were that would need to be relocated in the urban areas or even out in the middle of the farm fields, farmland. The utilities didn't even have a good idea of where their own lines were, which caused there to be a lot of problems where the authority would start construction on something and then discover utility lines that it needed to relocate, thus adding to cost increases and delays that had to be passed down to the authority and to the taxpayers. Why was the authority in such a rush to get this funding acquired? Why couldn't it have just waited and taken its sweet time? Well, one of the stipulations in Proposition 1A was that the funding given by the state needed to have a match from other sources, whether that be local governments, the federal government, or even private entities. So basically that meant that the Prop 1A funding, $9.9 billion in funding that was raised, couldn't be used until they found a match, in this case, which was the federal government. They didn't want to let this grant funding go to waste because it would delay the time that they could expend the actual Prop 1A funds. Well, as you can imagine, starting early and having all of these aforementioned issues caused a lot of problems downstream. The first cost estimates that were given in 2008 were that the project would cost between $33 and $40 billion to complete. That's the whole route from LA to San Francisco. As the authority realized some of these problems with their design, that there were concessions that needed to be made, that there were utilities that needed to be relocated that weren't accounted for, additional parcels that needed to be acquired, the cost ballooned significantly and was reflected in later cost estimates in business reports that came after. Since then, the authority has cited premature construction as the single most contributing factor to delays and cost overruns. Let me read a few passages from some of the previous business update reports. Their 2012 report reads, "The 2009 cost estimates were based on programmatic conceptual design. As noted previously, the cost estimates in this revised plan are based on a higher level of preliminary design." They continue. 80 to 85% of this increase is for additional viaducts, tunnels, embankments, and retaining walls and trenches directly attributable to changes in scope and alignment based on stakeholder input, environmental necessity, and improved knowledge of site conditions. This was in 2012, before things really started to hit the fan for them. So let's flip to a later issue. When looking at the business reports between 2008 and 2016, we tend to see that the authority obfuscates some of the reasons for these cost overruns. However, in 2018, that's when Brian Kelly became the CEO, the authority seems to take more responsibility and document more of the reasons why these cost increases were happening. Kelly went on many interviews, made himself available publicly, and was kind of a public face for an agency that had many problems previously. Let's take a look at the 2018 report and see what they had to say about these cost overruns. The 2018 report states the following. The current cost estimate for the Central Valley segment, $10.6 billion, reflects the realization of risks identified in the 2016 business plan and the 2017 project update report. These risks have now been quantified and are included in this revised estimate. These risks were primarily generated from issuing construction contracts early in the project development process that was primarily focused on project development and planning. There were many unknowns remaining, and setting fast-track schedules to meet the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act spending deadline increased risk by requiring multiple concurrent activities. Despite these risks, there have been many benefits derived from this decision. Construction was essential to addressing economic challenges in the Central Valley, an area struggling with high unemployment and poverty. The authority has estimated that the initial investment of ARRA funds has resulted in total economic activity of up to $5.9 billion in the Central Valley construction area. In addition, contracts were also executed in a highly competitive market. I much prefer this candid view over the challenges that they face. They also include a table documenting some of the current drivers and increased costs and how they intend to address them moving forward. Let's take a brief look at them. Here we have lacking enough resources to ramp up land acquisition, concessions to other stakeholders, increased number of parcels needed, snowballing of delays due to aforementioned problems, and organizational readiness. There are many other smaller, more specific issues that did contribute to the cost increases, though less significantly, like impoundment and lawsuits that were levied against the High-Speed Rail Authority. But those are a little bit out of the scope of this video. We don't have enough time. If you're interested, Adriana from Californians for Electric Rail wrote an article on our website talking in depth about that and other topics. So please check that out here on one of the corners. Many of the opponents of California high-speed rail like to suggest that it's a train to nowhere, touching on the fact that it's only going to operating, initially, between cities in the Central Valley. They say that these cities are small and insignificant and don't comprise a large enough population to justify high-speed rail. What they fail to recognize is that these cities are a very important part of California's economy, along with actually being pretty large population centers, ranking among the largest cities and counties in the state of California. Labeling these hardworking communities nowhere is frankly disrespectful to the value that this important region provides to our state and our whole country. I want to take a quick aside to talk about California's Central Valley. The Central Valley of California is an important yet often ignored part of the state and its economy. As a whole, California produces 3/4 of the country's fruit and nuts, along with 1/3 of the country's vegetables, with a large majority of this coming from the Central Valley. However, residents find themselves among the poorest in the state and are constantly bombarded with pollution from fires, transportation, and the agricultural industry. Most of the Central Valley's major population centers straddle the east side of the valley, connected by I-99, a historical route that used to be the main highway between north and south. When the Central Valley segment of I-5 was built, they chose to hug the west side, partially because it was the fastest route between the mega regions. While one of the main promotional points about California high-speed rail is that it will connect Los Angeles and San Francisco, another huge benefit often not mentioned is that it's also seeking to link the many Central Valley cities together in a meaningful way, which will provide a substantial economic boost to the currently disinvested region. After all, much of the initial federal grants from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act were designed to do just that, provide to communities that have been hit hard by the 2008 financial crash and following recession. In fact, this increased investment is most likely a factor in Proposition 1A passing in the first place. Many of the counties that voted yes for this measure in the Central Valley tended to lean conservative. On this vote, many counties that normally lean left but wouldn't receive direct benefits from better rail transportation between LA and San Francisco voted no. This includes Ventura, San Luis Obispo, San Diego, and even Sacramento. However, it seems a disproportionate number of red counties along the alignment voted yes. Counties like Kern, Fresno, and Merced were promised prominent stations and good-paying local construction jobs during a global recession, and I think that played part in convincing them to take a bet on the bullet train. These jobs are generated by the construction contractors that are actually building the route. To help fill these roles with local talent, the authority helped establish the Central Valley Training Center alongside the city of Selma and a few local trade groups. This program has proven to be extremely popular with the city of Selma and the graduates produced. Selma even recently extended it another 2 years. Since its inception, the program has graduated more than 250 students. If you would like to learn more about this program, I recommend reading the LA Times article on the subject here. Overall, California high-speed rail has generated 51,000 job hours in the Central Valley with $3.25 billion in direct labor income. Recently, things have been going better for the High-Speed Rail Authority. In 2017-2018, they gained the ability to acquire land in the Central Valley easier with the passage of a law in California. In 2019, they gained the ability to self-certify NEPA, which is the federal government's environmental quality law. As recently as last year, there's been many contract procurements that have gone through to clear the way for track and signal, along with the procurement of actual train sets that will run on the line. Most importantly, one of the 3 construction segments in the Central Valley is nearing significant completion, with work set to begin on the track soon. However, there's one more really important thing to acknowledge with the overall high-speed rail program and how the money has fed into other local projects. As part of the passage of Prop 1A, $1 billion was supposed to be set aside for improving regional transportation programs to make sure that all of these transportation projects on the bookends would be able to feed into this newly developed high-speed rail project. Things like Caltrain modernization, which you can see the fruit of that labor behind me in the form of electrification and brand new train sets, increased on-time performance and frequency of Caltrain in the Bay Area. That money also went towards things like the Central Subway in San Francisco, the Regional Connector in Los Angeles, signal improvement for Metrolink and Coaster in San Diego, along with improvements in Sacramento and throughout the rest of California. These are all really important projects, and it's great that a project like California High-Speed Rail was thinking ahead into making sure that these feeder systems would be able to provide people to use this newly built high-speed rail. So if the project is back on the track now, what's up with all the headlines calling it over budget, over time, and continuously saying that it needs more government assistance? Well, none surprisingly or surprisingly, this mainly comes down to how the project is actually funded. They get a very small amount from the federal government. A much larger chunk comes from state government, but it's very irregular. Out of that funding, there's a very tiny trickle that comes in that is actually regular and dependable. Thus, it creates a very irregular and non-dependable source of funding that the project constantly has to evaluate to make sure that they actually will have the funding to do the construction that they need to do. This has all resulted in the fact that currently the only part under construction is the Central Valley portion from Merced to Shafter, which is just north of Bakersfield. They still need another few billion to get it all the way to Bakersfield. As it stands now, the project is around $100 to $120 billion that it needs for funding. It's not funded anywhere near that, right? So the authority has opted to focus all of the construction in that Central Valley on that portion that I just mentioned. Since the construction is only occurring there, they're not able to parallelize and streamline it to get the timeline down as much as possible. If they were able to get, let's say, 100% of funding, they'd be able to start on the much longer lead time tunnels to the north and the south that would be needed to get the train all the way from San Francisco to Los Angeles. There's a lot of tunnels that cost a lot of money. They need to be started as soon as possible. It's also important to take a look at the project, though, from a global scale. Impressively enough, California High-Speed Rail is only about 1.4 times the global average per kilometer to build the project, right? This is really impressive considering that in the United States, construction projects are usually 2.5 times the world counterparts. We just take a lot of money to build the same construction projects here in the States. In fact, the Central Valley portion is even cheaper than that 1.4 times. It's about 1.2 times the global average per kilometer, which is saying a lot considering that this is the first actual true high-speed rail segment to be built in the United States. We don't have the expertise, we don't have the labor experience, we don't have the materials, and we need to import a lot of this knowledge and build it locally, which costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time. That's where I have a lot of issues with how the media is covering this project. The media, in a functioning democracy, is obviously supposed to offer a critical view on projects that the government and that other entities in the country are taking up on. And in the beginning, the project was deserving of very critical coverage. There was a lot of mismanagement, there were a lot of issues around construction, and it needed that extra eye from the media to tell the public what was going wrong and how it could be fixed. However, with a lot of these problems out of the way, most of the coverage nowadays seems to just be negative as political theater or as a way to take a stance against a project that many people really don't know that much about. Contrary to popular belief, high-speed rail is actually the most fiscally responsible option for expanding transportation capacity between the north and the south. Let me explain. The High-Speed Rail Authority does a study on the cost effectiveness of the system it's building every few years, and the last one was done in 2019. In it, it stated that adding equivalent transportation capacity to accommodate the demand in the next few years would be about $122 to $199 billion. That's in roadway and aviation capacity. This isn't even accounting for negative externalities of aviation and roadway capacity. Adding more cars to our roads and more planes to our skies obviously induces a lot more pollution into our environment and affects communities that have to live downstream of those improvements to airports and to freeways and roads, whatnot. High-speed rail does the opposite. It's powered by the grid. It gets people exactly where they need to go without giant parking lots needed or a lot more lanes for highways within cities required. It's the cost-effective and environmentally friendly solution for getting people from point A to point B in California.
The worst public infrastructure failure in U.S. history.
This is why the current calls to cancel the project by certain politicians and billionaires are increasingly bad faith and, in my opinion, done to either virtue signal against California politics, push the interests of the fossil fuel and automotive lobbies, or both. These politicians use California high-speed rail as a political punching bag. They want an easy target, and California high-speed rail is the perfect boogeyman for fictional, wasteful government spending. Especially in our current administration's nationwide fixation on slashing what they like to call government waste. A recent example of this was our new Transportation Secretary, Sean Duffy, along with some California representatives, making false claims about the current construction progress of the project. If you're interested in the thread we made debunking some of their claims, check us out on Blue Sky here. These people often state that the project should just be canceled outright, leaving all the progress to wither away, sealing the fate of those $13+ billion of taxpayer funds to truly be wasted. If these people were actually concerned with government efficiency, they would find themselves arriving at the conclusion similar to what the Independent Inspector General includes in their report, that the authority needs a larger and stable funding mechanism to be able to deliver this project on time and on budget. They may even find that the state should bring in some of this construction capacity in-house to save on future construction costs, considering that there are still the Sacramento and San Diego segments of Phase 2 that need to be planned and built out. Many of these people claim that there are cheaper or more high-tech solutions that will solve this problem. The truth is, whether it's Hyperloop, robotaxis, or underground tunnels for cars, the most cost-effective solution here is high-speed rail. The technology for these utopian techno-futurist solutions does not meaningfully exist yet, with many startups attempting to pursue the Hyperloop vision going out of business in the process. If you're interested in reading more about that, check out this piece written by Paris Marx about Hyperloop's past and its attempt at derailing the high-speed rail conversation. The authority estimates that completing the entire Phase 1 segment will require anything between $89 and $128 billion. However, they don't have a final date of completion, not because the agency does not have a strong plan, but due to the lack of required funds to complete the entire Phase 1 segment and bring the alignment out of the Central Valley. Currently, with enough funding to finish the 119 miles under construction, the authority faces a potential $6.5 billion funding gap, depending on the income from California's cap and trade program. If you're interested in learning more about California's carbon trading program, I recommend a read through CARB's website. Much of this funding is needed quickly in just the next 2 years to keep the current 2030 to 2033 window of completion for the Merced to Bakersfield segment. With the recent shift in attitude towards regional transportation projects from the federal government, the state has some heavy lifting ahead of them to make sure that this project is delivered on time. Without a dedicated larger funding stream, California high-speed rail will continue to be at risk of constant delays and budget increases. California high-speed rail has had its fair share of issues. It's been a very bumpy road to the place we find ourselves now. As the project continues, Californians need to recognize some hard truths. The great infrastructure projects of the world were not built overnight. They faced many of their own political battles, budget overruns, and timeline explosions, yet they continue inching forward along the constant march of progress. The initial Shinkansen in Japan was significantly over budget and took longer than expected to build, but served as a beacon of technological achievement when it was finished and continues to be regarded as part of one of, if not the best transportation systems in the world. The U.S. interstate highway system took decades to complete, but now serves as a piece of infrastructure that we cannot imagine living without. Should California, as the world's 6th largest economy, drop the ball as a leader on high-speed rail and succumb to austerity politics? Or should we stand tall and support a project that will once again fundamentally transform the way we move around our state and the way Americans view high-speed transportation? On the global stage, high-speed rail is a cornerstone of any successful national transportation network, but domestically, many states have tried and quit, following the former path. The groundwork has all been laid, and it's up to us to be educated about and to continue to advocate for connecting California together with high-speed rail. Want to get involved? Here's 3 things you can do. First, join Californians for Electric Rail. We're an advocacy group here in California that advocate for increasing passenger service and electrifying our rail-based transportation. Second, tell your senator and representatives to support Senate Bill 445. This aims to cut down on delays brought on by utilities for third-party permitting, something that has plagued California high-speed rail in the past. And third, support increased funding from cap and trade for California high-speed rail staffing and construction. We need to get this done, and the more money we can get to California high-speed rail, the better. Thanks for watching.